I realized my name wasn't in my husband's will the moment my daughter-in-law smiled. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in a law office that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the kind of place where people usually whisper out of respect for the past. I sat at the long wooden table with my hands folded neatly in my lap, listening as the attorney read through the final wishes of my husband, Robert Hayes, a man I had shared 38 years of marriage with. My son Daniel sat across from me, his shoulders slightly hunched as if the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Beside him sat his wife, Olivia, perfectly composed, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't taken a sip from. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued reading, his voice steady and professional, listing assets that Robert had worked a lifetime to build, the house in Cedar Ridge, the investment accounts, the small lake cabin in Wisconsin where we used to spend every 4th of July. As each item was mentioned, my eyes moved slowly from the attorney to my son and then to Olivia. Daniel kept staring at the table, avoiding my gaze. Olivia, however, watched the lawyer carefully, the corners of her mouth lifting just slightly every time another asset was mentioned. It was a subtle smile, the kind most people would miss, but after decades of raising a son and managing a household, I had learned to read small expressions. Then the attorney paused and turned the page. According to this document, he said, adjusting his glasses, the primary beneficiaries of Robert Hayes' estate are Daniel Hayes and his spouse, Olivia Hayes. For a moment, the room felt oddly quiet, as if the air itself had stopped moving. I waited for the next sentence. I expected to hear my name. After all, Robert had always told me he had made sure I would be taken care of. Instead, the lawyer continued reading through the legal language, describing percentages and property transfers. My name never came. Not once. Across the table, Olivia set her cup down gently and leaned back in her chair. Well, she said in a light, almost cheerful tone, looks like the house finally belongs to us. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her but didn't correct her. He didn't even look at me. I felt something tighten in my chest, though I kept my expression calm. Years of marriage teach you how to sit through uncomfortable conversations without letting the world see your thoughts. The attorney cleared his throat again, as if the comment had made him uneasy, and continued reviewing the document. I listened carefully now, every word landing heavier than the last. When he finished, he closed the folder slowly and looked up. That concludes the reading of the will, he said. Olivia exhaled softly, as if a long wait had finally ended. Daniel stood up almost immediately, mumbling something about needing fresh air. I rose from my chair more slowly. The room seemed smaller now than when I had entered it. I thanked the lawyer politely and began walking toward the door. Just as I reached for the handle, I heard his voice behind me. Mrs. Hayes, he said quietly. I turned. He hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the hallway where Daniel and Olivia had already disappeared. Then he lowered his voice. I've handled estate documents for more than 30 years, he said. And I have to admit, something about this one doesn't sit right with me. For the first time that afternoon, I felt the faint stir of a question forming in my mind, a quiet, persistent thought that refused to go away. If Robert truly meant to leave everything to Daniel and Olivia, then why had he looked at me only a week before he passed and said, with that calm certainty I knew so well, Margaret, no matter what happens, you'll always be protected. At the time, I believed him completely. Standing there in the hallway of that quiet law office, I realized something else just as clearly. Either my husband had changed his mind in secret, or someone had changed the story after he was gone. The drive home from the law office felt longer than the 15 miles it actually was. The late afternoon sun stretched across the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows over the familiar houses I had driven past for decades. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the day before, yet something inside me had shifted in a way that was difficult to describe. I parked my car in the driveway of the house Robert and I had bought 35 years earlier, the white 2-story home with the wide front porch he used to repaint every summer. For a moment I simply sat behind the wheel with the engine off, listening to the faint ticking sound of the cooling metal. Across the yard, the maple tree Robert planted when Daniel was 10 years old moved gently in the breeze. I remembered how proud he had been the day he dug that hole himself, insisting that one day the tree would grow tall enough to shade the whole yard. Now the branches stretched almost 40 feet into the sky, and the yard beneath it was quiet and empty. When I finally stepped inside the house, the silence felt heavier than usual. After Robert passed away 3 months earlier, I had grown used to the quiet mornings and evenings, but that afternoon the silence carried a different weight. I walked slowly through the hallway and into the kitchen, setting my purse on the counter exactly where I always did. The clock above the refrigerator read 4:15 in the afternoon. Around that time of day Robert used to sit at the kitchen table reading the newspaper while I prepared dinner. Sometimes he would glance over the top of his glasses and tell me about some article he had found interesting. The memory felt close enough that I almost expected to hear his voice again. Instead, there was only the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing outside. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, letting the events of the afternoon settle in my mind. The lawyer's words echoed again in my thoughts, the careful legal language that had placed everything Robert owned into Daniel and Olivia's hands. It did not make sense. Robert had always been methodical about paperwork. Every tax form, every insurance document, every investment statement had a place in the small filing cabinet in his office. He used to joke that if anyone ever needed to find something important, they would only have to open the top drawer and follow the labels. That was why the memory from a week before he passed away came back to me so clearly. Robert had been sitting in his recliner by the living room window, a blanket across his knees and a cup of tea on the side table. His voice had been calm, the same calm tone he used whenever he explained something important. He had looked at me and said that if anything ever seemed strange after he was gone, I should check the bank. At the time I had assumed he was talking about ordinary financial matters, perhaps a safety deposit box with old documents or photographs. I had nodded and told him not to worry about such things. Now, sitting alone at the kitchen table with the afternoon light fading through the window, that small conversation began to feel less like a casual remark and more like a quiet instruction that I had not understood until this moment. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time that evening, watching the last light of the day slowly fade across the backyard. The maple tree outside the window swayed gently in the breeze, its leaves casting soft moving shadows across the wooden floor. Robert used to say that the late afternoon light in our kitchen was the best part of the whole house. He said it made everything look calm, no matter how busy the day had been. That memory lingered in my mind as I finished my glass of water and stood up. For years Robert had handled nearly every financial detail in our lives, but he had always kept things organized in a way that allowed me to understand them if I needed to. That was why his words from that last week would not leave my thoughts. If anything ever seemed strange, check the bank. At the time I had smiled and told him not to worry. Now those words felt deliberate. I walked down the hallway toward Robert's study, the small room at the end of the house where he kept his desk and filing cabinet. The door was slightly open, just as it had been the day Daniel and Olivia stopped by after the funeral to help sort through some of Robert's belongings. They had insisted it would be easier if they handled the paperwork for me. At the time I had been grateful for the help. Now I remembered how quickly Olivia had stepped into this room, glancing around as if she were searching for something specific. I pushed the door open and turned on the desk lamp. The familiar warm light spread across the room, illuminating the shelves of neatly labeled binders Robert had maintained for years. The filing cabinet stood beside the desk, its drawers aligned perfectly the way Robert always kept them. I opened the top drawer slowly. Inside were the same folders I remembered: property taxes, insurance policies, investment statements, and the mortgage paperwork from decades earlier that Robert had kept even after the house was fully paid off. Everything appeared normal at first glance, yet something felt different. I began carefully looking through the folders one by one, reading each label and checking the documents inside. Robert had always been precise with his notes, often writing dates and small reminders in the margins of important papers. Tonight those little details felt like quiet messages left behind by someone who knew his work might need to be reviewed later. Nearly 20 minutes passed before I noticed the empty space. At the back of the drawer there was a narrow gap between two folders where another file should have been. The labels on either side read trust documents and estate planning. I stood there for a moment staring at that gap, trying to recall what used to sit there. Then the memory returned clearly. Robert had once shown me a red folder he kept for what he called contingency documents. He explained that it contained copies of certain legal papers along with information about a safety deposit box at the bank downtown. I had not thought about that conversation in years. Slowly, I closed the drawer and looked around the room again. Daniel and Olivia had only spent about an hour in here after the funeral, yet suddenly I could remember Olivia opening this very drawer while Daniel carried a box of papers out to the living room. At the time it had seemed like a normal part of organizing Robert's things. Now the quiet space where the red folder used to be felt much louder than any missing object should. I turned off the desk lamp and stood in the doorway of the study, my thoughts settling into a single clear decision. Tomorrow morning I would drive downtown to the bank Robert had used for more than 30 years. If there was something waiting inside that safety deposit box, it might finally explain why Robert had spoken so carefully in his final days. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen over Cedar Ridge. The house was quiet in that soft gray hour when the world has not quite decided whether the day has begun. I stood in the kitchen preparing a simple cup of coffee, moving slowly through the familiar routine that Robert and I had shared for decades. For years he had been the first one awake, stepping onto the porch with his coffee while the morning air was still cool. I used to tease him that no one needed to be awake at 6 in the morning unless they had somewhere important to go. That memory passed through my mind as I stared out the kitchen window toward the empty porch. After finishing my coffee I picked up my purse and car keys and stepped outside. The morning air carried the faint scent of fresh grass from a nearby lawnmower starting somewhere down the street. Cedar Ridge had always been a quiet town, the kind of place where people waved when they drove past each other and where the bank manager knew most customers by name. The bank Robert had used for more than 30 years stood just a few blocks from the town square, a solid brick building with tall windows and a small American flag hanging near the entrance. I parked along the curb and sat in the car for a moment, watching the front doors as people came and went. Robert had always trusted this place. He liked the idea of dealing with people he had known for years instead of anonymous offices in larger cities. Finally I stepped inside. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, and the quiet murmur of conversations echoed softly from behind the teller counters. A young employee greeted me politely, but before I could say much a familiar voice called my name. It was Mr. Henderson, the branch manager who had known Robert since the early 1990s. His expression softened when he saw me, and he walked around the counter to greet me personally. He asked how I had been managing since Robert passed away, speaking with the careful kindness people often use when they are not sure how much comfort to offer. I thanked him and explained that I needed to ask about something Robert once mentioned. When I spoke the words safety deposit box, his eyebrows lifted slightly in recognition. He nodded slowly and told me that Robert had indeed maintained a box here for many years. After checking a few records at his desk, he returned with a small metal key attached to a paper tag bearing Robert's name. He explained that as Robert's spouse I was authorized to access the box, though it had not been opened since the previous year. Hearing that detail sent a quiet ripple of curiosity through my mind. Mr. Henderson guided me through a secured door and down a short hallway into the vault room. The walls were lined with rows of small metal boxes, each identical except for the engraved numbers beside their locks. He located Robert's box, inserted the bank key into the lock, and stepped back so I could use the smaller key Robert had kept on his key ring. My hands were steady as I turned the key, though my thoughts moved quickly. When the small drawer finally slid open, Mr. Henderson placed it gently on the table and excused himself to give me privacy. I stood there alone in the quiet vault room for several seconds before lifting the lid. Inside was a neatly sealed envelope, thick cream-colored paper with Robert's familiar handwriting across the front. Beneath it rested a red folder, the same color I remembered seeing in his study years earlier. At that moment the quiet instruction Robert had given me began to make perfect sense. I lifted the cream-colored envelope first, turning it slowly in my hands as if the weight of the paper alone might reveal what Robert had intended to tell me. His handwriting across the front was unmistakable. Robert had always written carefully, each letter precise and deliberate, the same way he approached everything else in his life. The envelope simply said Margaret, written in blue ink. For a moment I hesitated before opening it, aware that whatever was inside might explain more than I was ready to hear. Finally, I slid my finger beneath the sealed edge and unfolded the letter inside. The paper carried the faint scent of the study where Robert used to spend his evenings reading financial reports or writing notes for the next day. His message was not long, but every sentence felt thoughtful, as if he had chosen each word with care. He wrote that if I was reading this letter, it meant something had not gone the way he expected. Robert explained that during the final months of his illness he had begun to notice unusual questions from Daniel and Olivia about his estate documents. At first he believed they were simply worried about the future, but over time their curiosity became more focused. They asked about specific papers, about where certain files were stored, and about whether the will had been updated recently. Robert wrote that he never wanted to believe his own son might be influenced by pressure or impatience, yet he also believed that preparation was a form of protection. That was why he created a second set of documents and placed them here in the bank where no one else would think to search. When I finished reading the letter, I placed it carefully on the table beside the metal box and opened the red folder beneath it. Inside were several neatly arranged documents held together with a small binder clip. The first pages were legal statements written by Robert's attorney more than a year earlier. They described a supplementary estate directive, a document designed to take effect only under very specific circumstances. I read the lines slowly, making sure I understood each one clearly. The directive explained that if the primary will was ever altered, replaced, or presented in a way that excluded Robert's spouse from her rightful share of the estate, then the supplementary document would override the original distribution entirely. Instead of transferring the house and investments to Daniel and Olivia, the estate would move into a protected trust that ensured I retained full ownership of the family home and financial stability for the rest of my life. Only after my lifetime would any remaining assets be considered for distribution to other family members. I sat there quietly in the vault room, reading through the pages twice to be certain I had not misunderstood them. The meaning was unmistakable. Robert had anticipated the possibility that someone might attempt to change the story after he was gone. That realization did not bring anger or shock the way some people might expect. Instead, it brought a calm clarity that settled slowly through my thoughts. Robert had not written this document out of suspicion alone. He had written it because he understood people, even the people closest to him. After placing the letter back inside the folder, I closed the lid of the safety deposit box and rested my hands on the cool metal surface for a moment. Whatever had happened during the reading of that will at the lawyer's office had not been the final chapter Robert intended. In fact, it appeared that the real instructions had been waiting here quietly all along. When I stepped out of the vault room, the quiet hallway of the bank felt different from when I had entered it earlier that morning. Mr. Henderson was waiting near his desk, politely pretending to review a stack of papers so that I would not feel rushed. When he saw me approach, he offered a small respectful nod, the kind people give when they understand that something important has just taken place. I thanked him for his help and explained that I would need certified copies of the documents I had found. He listened carefully and assured me the bank could assist with that request. Within a few minutes he arranged for the red folder and its contents to be scanned and copied under proper record, something Robert had likely anticipated when he placed the documents there. While the copies were being prepared, I sat quietly in one of the chairs near the manager's office. My thoughts moved calmly now, no longer clouded by confusion. The events from the lawyer's office the previous afternoon began to arrange themselves in a clearer order. Olivia's small smile, Daniel's refusal to meet my eyes, the lawyer's hesitation as he read through the will. At the time it had felt like a simple shock, a sudden realization that something had been taken from me. Now I understood that the situation was more complicated than that. Someone had presented a version of Robert's will that told only part of the story. Whether that had been done through impatience, assumption, or something more deliberate was a question that would soon have an answer. Mr. Henderson returned with a neat envelope containing the certified copies along with the original documents carefully resealed inside the red folder. I placed them into my purse with the same steady hands Robert used whenever he handled important papers. Before leaving the bank, I thanked Mr. Henderson once again for his assistance. He walked me to the front door and told me that Robert had always been one of the most organized customers the bank had ever known. I smiled softly at that remark because it was exactly the quality that had protected me now. Outside, the late morning sun had risen higher above the town square, brightening the sidewalks and storefront windows along Main Street. Cedar Ridge looked as peaceful as it always had, with people carrying coffee cups and greeting one another as they crossed the street. I drove home slowly, allowing the quiet rhythm of the road to give my thoughts space. When I reached the house, I set the red folder carefully on the dining room table where Robert and I used to review our annual paperwork together every spring. Seeing the documents there brought a quiet sense of order back into the room. The next step was clear. I picked up the telephone and dialed the number of Robert's attorney, the same man who had read the will the day before. When he answered, I spoke calmly and asked if we could schedule another meeting as soon as possible. There was a brief pause on the line before he agreed, his tone noticeably more serious than before. As I hung up the phone, I looked once more at Robert's careful handwriting on the letter resting beside the folder. Whatever confusion had filled that law office yesterday was about to be replaced with the full story Robert had prepared long before any of us realized it would be needed. The following afternoon I arrived at the attorney's office a few minutes early, carrying the red folder inside my purse as carefully as if it were something fragile. The same quiet receptionist greeted me and asked me to take a seat while the attorney prepared the meeting room. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before, yet the atmosphere felt different now that I understood what Robert had arranged. I sat calmly in the waiting area, watching the soft light from the windows stretch across the carpet. A few minutes later the attorney stepped into the hallway and invited me inside. His expression was serious, though there was also a trace of curiosity in his eyes. He closed the door behind us and asked if I had discovered something that might explain the concerns he mentioned after the will reading. Without speaking immediately, I placed the red folder on the table and opened it so he could see the documents inside. For several moments he read through the pages carefully, his eyes moving back and forth across the legal language Robert had prepared long before his illness became serious. As he continued reading, his posture straightened slightly, the same reaction a professional has when he recognizes the importance of a document he had not expected to see. Finally he removed his glasses and rested them on the table beside the folder. He said quietly that the supplementary directive Robert had created was both valid and very specific. According to the language written in those pages, the distribution presented during the previous day's meeting could not be considered complete without acknowledging the protective clause Robert had placed in the safety deposit box. The attorney explained that this type of directive was designed for situations in which an estate document might be presented in a way that did not reflect the full intentions of the person who created it. Hearing those words confirmed what had already begun forming in my thoughts. Robert had anticipated confusion, perhaps even pressure, and he had left a clear instruction about how to resolve it. The attorney leaned back in his chair and folded his hands thoughtfully for a moment before speaking again. He said that the most responsible course of action would be to arrange another formal meeting with all parties present so the supplementary document could be reviewed alongside the original will. That way there would be no misunderstanding about Robert's final intentions. I nodded in agreement because that was exactly what I had expected. Before leaving the office, the attorney asked if I felt comfortable returning the following day when Daniel and Olivia could also attend. I told him that I had no reason to avoid that conversation. As I stood to leave, he placed the documents carefully back into the red folder and handed it to me with a respectful nod. Walking out of the building, I felt the same calm clarity that had settled over me in the bank vault earlier that morning. Robert had never been a man who left important matters unfinished. Whatever explanation Daniel and Olivia believed they had found in that first will reading, it was about to be measured against the careful plan Robert had written long before anyone else realized it existed. The following day the sky above Cedar Ridge was clear and bright, the kind of calm morning that usually made the town feel peaceful. When I arrived at the attorney's office, Daniel and Olivia were already there. Through the glass door I could see them sitting in the same chairs they had used 2 days earlier. Olivia was scrolling through her phone while Daniel leaned back with his arms folded across his chest. Neither of them noticed me immediately. I stepped inside quietly and greeted the receptionist before walking toward the meeting room. Daniel looked up first, clearly surprised to see me there again so soon. Olivia's expression shifted only slightly, the same polite smile she had worn during the previous meeting returning to her face. She asked if something had been forgotten the other day. I simply told her the attorney had requested another meeting so that everything could be reviewed properly. A few minutes later the attorney entered the room carrying several documents. He greeted everyone calmly and asked us to take our seats. The atmosphere in the room felt heavier than before, though no one had raised their voice. The attorney began by explaining that after reviewing the estate materials again, he had discovered an additional directive prepared by Robert Hayes more than a year before his passing. Daniel leaned forward slightly at those words while Olivia's polite smile faded into a more cautious expression. The attorney placed the red folder on the table and opened it slowly so that everyone could see the documents inside. He explained that the directive was legally binding and specifically designed to clarify Robert's intentions if the primary will was ever presented without its full supporting documentation. Daniel frowned as he listened, clearly trying to understand where this explanation was going. Olivia remained very still beside him, her attention fixed on the pages in front of the attorney. When the attorney finished reading the key section of the directive, the meaning became unmistakably clear. The supplementary document confirmed that Robert's estate was not meant to transfer ownership of the house or financial accounts directly to Daniel and Olivia while I was still alive. Instead, the directive established a protective trust ensuring that I retained complete control of the family home and financial security for the rest of my life. Only after my lifetime would any remaining assets be distributed according to Robert's broader estate plan. The room grew quiet as the attorney finished speaking. Daniel looked from the documents to me, confusion written across his face as if he had just discovered that a puzzle he believed solved was actually missing several pieces. Olivia's expression was more difficult to read, though the confident smile she had worn earlier was gone. The attorney closed the folder gently and explained that because the directive had been properly signed, witnessed, and stored according to Robert's instructions, it carried full legal authority alongside the original will. In other words, the reading from 2 days earlier had only revealed part of Robert's estate plan. The complete version had been waiting quietly in a bank vault until the moment it was needed. I sat calmly at the table as the explanation settled over the room. Robert had not left confusion behind him. He had left clarity, carefully prepared and patiently waiting to be discovered. For several seconds after the attorney finished speaking, no one in the room said anything. The silence was not loud or dramatic, but it carried a weight that made every small movement feel noticeable. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, staring at the documents as though he were trying to read them from across the table. Olivia remained very still beside him, her hands folded together in front of her, the confidence she had displayed 2 days earlier now replaced by careful restraint. The attorney allowed the quiet moment to settle before speaking again. He explained in a calm and professional tone that Robert Hayes had been extremely precise in the way he prepared his estate plan. The supplementary directive was not an afterthought or a simple note of clarification. It had been drafted intentionally to ensure that his wife would remain protected regardless of how the original will might later be interpreted or presented. The attorney also explained that because the directive had been properly witnessed and stored according to Robert's written instructions, it legally carried the same authority as the primary will itself. In practical terms, this meant that the ownership of the Cedar Ridge house, the investment accounts, and the remaining assets of the estate would remain under my full control during my lifetime. Only after that time would any further distribution be considered. Daniel finally spoke, though his voice sounded uncertain in a way I had rarely heard from him before. He asked whether the directive meant that the earlier reading had been incorrect. The attorney answered carefully, explaining that the previous meeting had not been wrong, only incomplete. Robert's plan had simply included more than one document, and the second document had been waiting in the safety deposit box until the moment it was needed. Olivia looked down at the table for several seconds before quietly asking why Robert would have arranged something like that. The attorney responded that many people who manage complex estates choose to include protective clauses to prevent misunderstandings or disputes after their passing. He added that Robert had clearly taken great care to make sure his intentions would be followed exactly as he had written them. I listened to the conversation without interrupting, feeling the same calm clarity that had settled over me since the moment I opened the safety deposit box. Robert had always believed that the best way to handle difficult situations was through preparation rather than confrontation. That was why he organized every document, every account, and every instruction with such care. Eventually the attorney closed the folder and placed both hands on the table. He said that from a legal standpoint the matter was now clear. Robert's estate plan would move forward according to the full set of documents he had prepared. The meeting ended quietly after that. Daniel stood first, still processing what he had heard, while Olivia gathered her things without saying much more. I remained seated for a moment longer, looking at the red folder resting on the table. Robert had once told me that the true measure of a plan was whether it still worked even when circumstances changed. As I stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight of Cedar Ridge, I realized that Robert had not only left behind a home and a lifetime of memories. He had also left behind the quiet certainty that the life we built together would remain exactly where it belonged.